For 20 years, billionaire Daniel Whitmore had only one reason to never return to the small Kentucky town where he grew up: Emily Carter. She was the girl he had promised to marry before ambition took him to New York, and the woman he abandoned without ever looking back. But when Daniel returned to sell his late father's abandoned property, he found Emily living in a deteriorating farmhouse at the end of an old dirt road. She wasn't alone. Standing beside her was a 14-year-old boy. The boy stared at Daniel's face, then at the black SUV behind him, and asked something that made Emily turn pale. "Are you Daniel Whitmore?" Daniel froze. "Yes." The boy reached into his backpack and pulled out an old photograph. It showed Daniel at 23, standing beside Emily. Written across the back, in the handwriting of Daniel's dead father, were 6 words: "When Daniel returns, tell him everything." Daniel looked at Emily. "What is this?" She grabbed the photograph from the boy. "You weren't supposed to see that." But the boy wasn't finished. He looked directly at Daniel. "Then tell him what Grandpa told me." Daniel's expression changed. "Grandpa?" The boy pointed toward the abandoned Whitmore house across the field. "Your father came here every month for 11 years. Daniel couldn't speak. His father had spent the last 11 years of his life telling Daniel that Emily had left town decades ago. But that wasn't the biggest lie. Because when Daniel finally entered his father's locked study that night, he discovered hundreds of cancelled checks made out to Emily, photographs of the boy from every birthday, and a sealed letter addressed to Daniel that had never been sent. And inside that letter was a confession capable of changing everything Daniel believed about why Emily disappeared, and why his father had spent 11 years secretly taking care of a child who wasn't his grandson. The drive from the Louisville airport had taken almost 2 hours, and for most of it, Daniel Whitmore hadn't looked up from his phone once. Deals didn't wait for grief. Neither did shareholders. His assistant had booked him a return flight for the following evening, and Daniel intended to use every hour of it efficiently, sign the paperwork on his father's estate, list the land with a local broker, and be back in his Manhattan office before his Thursday morning call with the board. That was the plan. Daniel Whitmore had built a career and eventually an empire on plans, on spreadsheets that told him exactly how a day, a quarter, a decade should unfold. He had learned a long time ago that comfort came from control, and control came from never letting anything or anyone surprise him. It was a lesson he'd taught himself at 23, standing at a Greyhound station in Millbrook County with one suitcase and a business plan he'd scribbled on the back of a diner placemat, promising himself he would never again feel as powerless as he had growing up poor in a house where the electricity got shut off twice a year. He hadn't set foot in Millbrook County since, not for his mother's funeral, which he'd paid for from 3 states away, not for a single Thanksgiving, birthday, or homecoming in 22 years. His father, Walter, had visited him in New York a handful of times over the decades. Always brief, always a little strained, the two of them talking about weather and crops and Daniel's latest deal, carefully circling anything that actually mattered. Daniel had told himself that was simply how Whitmore men operated. Distant, practical, unsentimental. He was about to learn just how much distance his father had actually been protecting him from. The town hadn't changed much. Daniel noticed that the moment they passed the old Millbrook Feed and Seed, its sign still hand-painted, still leaning slightly to one side the way it had leaned for as long as he could remember. They passed the diner where he'd worked weekends as a teenager, the church his mother used to drag him to on Sundays, the county courthouse where his father had once stood in line for 2 hours to fight a tax assessment he couldn't afford to pay. Every landmark was a small, quiet accusation. You left all of this behind, they seemed to say. You built skyscrapers and told yourself you'd outgrown a town that never stopped needing people to actually show up for each other. Daniel had a rehearsed answer for that accusation, one he'd used for over 20 years whenever the guilt crept in during a quiet moment. Someone had to leave. Someone had to prove it was possible to escape a place like Millbrook County and build something bigger. He told himself that story so many times, it had started to feel less like a justification and more like a fact of nature, as fixed and unquestionable as the Kentucky hills rolling by outside his window. He would not get to keep that story much longer. The plan fell apart the moment his driver turned off Route 9 onto the gravel road that led toward what used to be the Whitmore family farm, and Daniel saw the mailbox at the end of a neighboring dirt driveway. The paint was chipped, but he could still make out the name stenciled across the side in faded block letters. Carter. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 22 years. He hadn't needed to. It lived permanently somewhere behind his ribs, in the part of him that still occasionally, in the middle of a board meeting or a red-eye flight, would ask him whether the life he built was actually worth what it cost. He told the driver to stop the car. He told himself he was only looking. That the past was the past, and he was 45 years old now, not 23, and whatever had happened on that farm 2 decades ago belonged to a version of himself he barely recognized in old photographs. He told himself a lot of things in the 60 seconds it took him to open the car door and step out onto the gravel. Then he saw her. Emily Carter was standing on the porch of a farmhouse that had clearly seen better decades, the kind of home that had been beautiful once, with good bones and a wraparound porch, but that time and money troubles had slowly worn down to something closer to survival than comfort. She was wearing a faded flannel shirt, her hair pulled back, a laundry basket balanced on her hip. She looked older, of course. 22 years does that. But Daniel would have known her anywhere, in any light, at any age. She saw him at the exact same moment. The laundry basket nearly slipped from her hands. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The wind moved through the tall grass between the two properties, and somewhere a screen door creaked, and the only sound besides that was the low idle of Daniel's rented SUV behind him. Then a boy stepped out from behind her. He looked to be somewhere around 14 or 15, tall for his age, with sandy brown hair and a watchfulness in his eyes that seemed far too old for his face. He looked at Daniel, then at the SUV, then back at Daniel, studying him the way you'd study a stranger you'd been warned about your whole life. "Are you Daniel Whitmore?" the boy asked. Something in Daniel's chest went very still. "Yes," he said. "I am." The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the worn canvas backpack slung over one shoulder and pulled out a photograph, its edges soft and rounded from years of handling. He held it out. Daniel took it without thinking, and when he looked down, the air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. It was him, 23 years old, grinning in a way he hadn't grinned in decades, one arm slung around Emily Carter's shoulders in front of the old grain silo that used to stand behind the Whitmore barn. He remembered the exact day it was taken. He remembered thinking in that moment that he had never been happier and never would be again. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting Daniel would have recognized in his sleep, the same handwriting that had signed his report cards, co-signed his first business loan, and 3 weeks earlier signed a will leaving Daniel a piece of land he no longer wanted, were 6 words. "When Daniel returns, tell him everything." Daniel looked up at Emily. His voice, when it came, didn't sound like his own. "What is this?" Emily crossed the porch in 3 fast steps and pulled the photograph out of the boy's hands, her face suddenly pale in a way that had nothing to do with the August heat. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said, though Daniel couldn't tell if she was talking to him or to the boy. But the boy wasn't finished. He straightened his shoulders and looked directly at Daniel with an intensity that made the billionaire, a man who negotiated 8-figure acquisitions without blinking, feel, for the first time in years, completely unprepared. "Then tell him what Grandpa told me," the boy said. Daniel's expression changed. Something cold moved through him. "Grandpa?" The boy raised one hand and pointed across the field, toward the sagging roofline of the old Whitmore farmhouse, just visible over the ridge, the house Daniel had flown down, specifically to empty out and sell. "Your father came here every month for 13 years, the boy said. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. Because his father, Walter Whitmore, had told him, more than once in more than one phone call over the years, that Emily Carter had packed up and left Millbrook County for good, sometime back in the mid-2000s. Gone to Ohio, his father said, or maybe Tennessee. Nobody really knew and nobody really asked. That had been a lie, and Daniel was starting to understand it wasn't the only one. That night, Daniel didn't go to a hotel. He told himself it was because there wasn't one worth driving to before dark, But the truth was closer to the surface than he wanted to admit. He needed to see the house, his father's house, the house he'd grown up in and hadn't stepped foot inside in almost 2 decades. The porch light didn't work. Neither did most of the switches on the first floor, the electricity having been shut off months earlier after Walter's death. Daniel used the flashlight on his phone to move through rooms that smelled like dust and old cedar, past furniture draped in white sheets, until he reached the one door in the house that had always, for as long as Daniel could remember, stayed locked: his father's study. He found the spare key exactly where it had always been, taped beneath the bottom drawer of the hallway credenza, a hiding spot so obvious it had never once occurred to young Daniel to check it, and so effective that it had apparently worked for over 40 years. The door creaked open onto a room frozen in time. Daniel expected old business ledgers, farm equipment receipts, maybe some sentimental junk his father could never bring himself to throw away. What he found instead, in a locked filing cabinet in the corner, was a manila folder 3 inches thick. He sat down at his father's desk and opened it. Before he even reached the checks, he found a small stack of loose papers held together with a rusted binder clip, receipts mostly, from a hardware store 2 towns over, for things like roofing shingles, a used water heater, a case of canned goods bought in bulk from a wholesale club in Bowling Green. Daniel stared at them for a long moment before understanding settled over him. His father hadn't just been sending checks. He had been driving, quietly, month after month, delivering supplies himself, patching a roof with his own 2 aging hands, rather than trust the errand to anyone who might ask questions in a town where everyone eventually asked questions about everything. Cancelled checks. Dozens of them, no hundreds going back years, each one made out to Emily Carter, each one for a modest but consistent amount, the kind of money that wouldn't make headlines, but would absolutely keep a struggling household fed, clothed, and warm through a Kentucky winter. Behind the checks were photographs, school photos mostly, the kind schools sent home every fall. A boy growing year by year from a gap-toothed 6-year-old into the teenager Daniel had met that afternoon. Someone had written a name and an age on the back of each one in careful handwriting. Caleb, age 7. Caleb, age 9. Caleb, age 12. Caleb, age 16. Daniel lingered on that last one longest. It had been taken only a few months before Walter's death, the boy standing in front of the same farmhouse porch Daniel had stood on 2 days earlier, holding up a certificate of some kind, grinning in a way that reminded Daniel, uncomfortably, of the way Robert used to grin as a kid before everything went wrong. On the back, beneath the name and age, his father had added a single extra line in handwriting that looked shakier than the rest, like it had been written closer to the end. Honor roll again. Told him his grandfather was proud. Didn't tell him why I really am. And at the very bottom of the folder, beneath everything else, was an envelope, sealed. Daniel's name written across the front in his father's unmistakable hand. The postage stamp in the corner had never been used. It had never been mailed. It had simply been kept for years waiting. Daniel's hands were shaking by the time he tore it open. The letter inside was 4 pages long, and Daniel read every word twice before he could make himself believe what he was reading. His father wrote that he was sorry. Sorrier than he knew how to say in a letter, sorrier than he'd been able to say to Daniel's face while he was alive, which was, Walter admitted, the real reason he'd never sent it. He wrote that he had discovered the truth about Caleb roughly 14 years earlier, when Emily had finally come to him, desperate and out of options, needing help she had sworn for years she would never ask for. And what she told him that day had shattered every assumption Walter Whitmore had made about his own family for over a decade. Caleb wasn't Daniel's son. The dates made that impossible, and Walter had confirmed it himself before he ever believed a word of what came next. Caleb was his brother's son, Robert's son. Daniel had to set the letter down for a moment. He hadn't thought about his younger brother Robert in years, not in any way that went past the surface. Everyone in Millbrook County had the same story about Robert Whitmore. Bright kid, promising kid, until something changed in his early 20s, and he started running with the wrong people, drinking too much, borrowing money he couldn't pay back. And then, one autumn, he simply wasn't around anymore. Gone, everyone said. Ran off, probably somewhere out west, sorting himself out, too proud or too ashamed to call home. Daniel had believed that story for 22 years. His father's letter told a different one. According to Walter, Robert hadn't run away at all. In the months before he disappeared, Robert had discovered something troubling about the land development company Daniel's earliest business partner, a man named Gerald Ashford, had quietly been building, a company that used shell buyers and intermediaries to pressure struggling family farms across 3 counties into selling their land far below value, farms that were then flipped, rezoned, and folded into what eventually became the foundation of Whitmore and Ashford Development, the very company Daniel had built his fortune on. One of those farms had belonged to the Carter family. Robert had found the paperwork. He'd found Daniel's signature on documents authorizing the purchase agreements, signatures Daniel had given 22 years earlier on a stack of routine-looking papers his partner had told him were standard incorporation filings. Daniel had signed without reading closely, eager, hungry, 23 years old, and desperate to prove himself in New York. He hadn't known what those signatures actually authorized. He hadn't asked. Robert had tried to expose it. And 3 weeks after he started asking questions, Robert Whitmore vanished from Millbrook County and was never seen again. Walter's letter said he had spent years, quietly, without ever telling Daniel, without ever going to the authorities in any way that might have exposed the family or the company or Daniel's own signature on those documents, trying to find out what actually happened to his younger son. He never got a clear answer. What he did find eventually was Emily, alone raising a boy who was his own grandson, in a farmhouse that was falling apart because her family's land, the land that should have supported them for generations, had been taken by the very company bearing the Whitmore name. So Walter did the only thing he felt he still could. He helped. Quietly, monthly, for 13 years, without ever telling Daniel any of it because, as the letter finally admitted in Walter's careful, guilty handwriting, he was afraid of exactly what was now happening. He was afraid that if Daniel found out the truth about how his fortune had really been built, and about what had really happened to his brother, it would destroy him. The letter ended with a single line, underlined twice. "I should have told you the truth while I was alive to help you carry it. I'm sorry I was a coward instead. Please find out what really happened to your brother, and please take care of that boy. He is a Whitmore, whether the world knows it or not." Daniel sat alone in his father's study until sunrise, the letter in his hands, 22 years of certainty about his own life quietly collapsing around him. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, he found himself doing something he hadn't done since he was a boy, talking out loud to an empty room, to a father who couldn't answer him anymore. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he said, to the dark study, to the rows of unread ledgers, to the framed photograph of his mother still hanging crooked on the wall. "I would have listened. I would have fixed it." Even as he said it, some honest, unflattering part of him wasn't entirely sure that was true. The Daniel Whitmore who left Millbrook County at 23 had wanted more than almost anything to never look back. Maybe his father had understood that better than Daniel understood it about himself. By the time the first grey light came through the study window, Daniel had made a decision, even if he didn't yet know how large its consequences would turn out to be. He was not getting back on that flight to New York. Not yet. Not until he understood exactly what his family and his company had done. He didn't sleep that night. When the sun came up over the ridge, he was still sitting at his father's desk, the folder of checks and photographs spread out in front of him like evidence in a trial he hadn't known he was standing for. And in a strange way, that's exactly what it was. He drove to the Carter farmhouse just after 8 in the morning. Emily answered the door before he even knocked, like she'd been standing at the window waiting, dreading, maybe hoping. "We need to talk," Daniel said. "All 3 of us." Caleb was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal going soft in front of him, watching the exchange with the same guarded intensity he'd had the day before. Emily hesitated a long moment before stepping aside to let Daniel in. The kitchen was small and worn but clean, and Daniel noticed, almost against his will, the careful way it had been kept. Mismatched but well-loved dish towels, a child's height marked in pencil on the doorframe going back years. A corkboard covered in school photographs and hand-drawn cards that said things like, "Happy birthday, Mom," in a 7-year-old's careful printing. It looked nothing like the sterile, catered perfection of Daniel's Manhattan penthouse. It looked, he thought with a pang he wasn't prepared for, like a home. He set the sealed letter, now opened, now read, on the kitchen table between them. "I found this in my father's study last night," he said. "I know about Caleb. I know he's not my son. I know he's Robert's." Emily's shoulders dropped, some invisible weight finally leaving them after what must have been years of carrying it alone. "I wanted to tell you so many times," she said quietly. "Walter made me promise not to. He said it wasn't safe. Not until he could prove what happened, not until he understood exactly how deep it went with Gerald Ashford and the company. And then he died, before he ever got the chance." "Prove what happened to Robert," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. Emily nodded slowly. "You knew," Daniel said, and for the first time in the conversation his voice cracked slightly. "All these years you knew what happened to my family's land. You knew what my company did to yours. And you let me believe you just left, that you didn't want me anymore." "I didn't leave you, Daniel." Emily's eyes filled, but her voice stayed steady. 22 years of practice holding it together. "Your business partner's company took my family's farm out from under us while you were 3 states away building your empire. My father lost everything. He had a stroke 8 months later, and I spent the next several years just trying to keep this house, keep food on the table, and eventually keep Robert's son safe once Robert was gone, and I realized I was the only family Caleb had left who wasn't hiding from something." Caleb, who had been silently pushing his spoon around the bowl of soggy cereal, finally looked up. "What happened to my dad?" he asked. His voice was quiet, but it filled the whole kitchen. "Nobody has ever actually told me. Not really. Every time I ask Mom, she'd get this look on her face and change the subject. Every time I asked Grandpa Walter, before he died, he'd say I was too young to understand, and that someday, when the time was right, he'd tell me everything I needed to know. He kept saying that for years. Then he just died and never told me anything." The bitterness in the boy's voice startled Daniel more than he expected. It wasn't anger exactly, or not only anger. It was the exhausted frustration of someone who had spent his entire childhood being handed half-truths dressed up as kindness, told he was being protected, when really he was simply being managed. "That's fair," Daniel said quietly. "You deserved better than that. All of us should have told you the truth a long time ago, and I'm sorry that fell to a stranger, showing up in your driveway with a photograph instead." Caleb studied him for a moment, like he was testing whether the apology was real or just another practiced line from a man who negotiated for a living. "I don't know yet," Daniel finally said, "but I'm going to find out. I promise you that." It was not a promise Daniel made lightly, and it was not one he had any idea in that moment how he was actually going to keep. Over the following days, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He stopped delegating and started digging personally into records that made him increasingly sick to his stomach. He spent his first full day at the Millbrook County Clerk's office, sitting at a scratched laminate table in a records room that smelled like old paper and coffee, working through property transfer files with a clerk named Sharon Boyd, who had known his family for 30 years and clearly had complicated feelings about helping a Whitmore dig through the county's darkest financial history. "Your daddy used to come in here sometimes," she told him at one point, sliding another box of files across the table, "asking about the same records you're asking about now. Never told me why. I always figured it was just an old man being nosy about the neighbors." She paused, studying Daniel's face. "Guess it wasn't that at all." He pulled county land filings going back over 2 decades. He found the shell companies, 3 of them registered in Delaware, each one eventually folded into Whitmore and Ashford Development, under names so blandly corporate that nobody outside a forensic accountant would ever have thought to question them. Bluegrass Acquisition Partners, Heritage Farmland Holdings, Cumberland Ridge Investments. He found the pattern: struggling family farms, sudden liens filed by obscure lending entities, aggressive buyout offers timed to hit families at their most desperate, right after a bad harvest, right after a medical bill, right after a bank threatened foreclosure, and his own signature, 23 years old and naive, authorizing 3 of the earliest transactions without ever understanding what he was signing. He found the Carter family's file specifically on his 3rd day of searching, and reading it felt like watching a slow-motion car accident he already knew the ending to. A lien filed against Emily's father's land 18 months after Daniel left for New York, tied to a debt Daniel would later learn had been fabricated through a paperwork technicality nobody in the Carter family had the legal resources to challenge. A buyout offer, aggressive and lowball, arriving 6 weeks later, a forced sale within the year. Emily's father, a proud man who had farmed that land his whole life, had signed the paperwork sitting at the same kitchen table where Daniel had confronted Emily and Caleb days earlier, believing he had no other choice, and buried in an old county sheriff's file that had never been properly closed, he found a missing persons report filed 22 years earlier by a Millbrook County resident, Robert Whitmore, last seen leaving a meeting at the regional offices of Ashford Land Holdings. Case status: inactive. Daniel sat with that file for a long time. He also, before leaving Millbrook County to confront Ashford, drove back out to the Carter farmhouse one more time, not for answers this time, but because some instinct told him he owed Emily a warning before he lit a match under everything. He found her hanging laundry on a line behind the house, the same ordinary chore she'd been doing the first time he saw her again after 2 decades. "I'm going to New York," he told her. "I'm going to confront Ashford about the land and about Robert. I need you to know that whatever happens after that, it's not going to be quiet. It's going to be ugly, and it might cost me the company, and I need you to be ready for reporters and lawyers showing up around here asking questions about Caleb." Emily kept pinning a shirt to the line, not looking at him. "You think I haven't already lived through ugly, Daniel? I've been living through ugly since I was 22 years old. Go do what you need to do. Just don't you dare come back here afterward looking for credit for finally doing the right thing 22 years too late." It was not gentle. Daniel didn't ask it to be. He simply nodded, got back in his car, and drove to the airport. He confronted Gerald Ashford 3 days later in Ashford's own Manhattan office, 41 floors above the traffic, with the kind of view that made you forget entirely what it had cost to earn it. Ashford was 71 now, silver-haired, immaculately composed, the picture of a man who had spent decades believing his sins would stay buried under enough zeros. "I know what you did to the Carter farm," Daniel said without preamble, sliding the county filings across the polished desk. "And I know what happened to Robert." For a long moment, Ashford didn't move. Then quietly, almost tiredly, he walked to the window overlooking Fifth Avenue, hands clasped behind his back, and let out a long breath before he spoke again. "You want to know something, Daniel? I liked your brother. Robert had a spine none of the rest of us wanted him to have. He came into this office 22 years ago with a folder just like the one you're holding now, and he sat right where you're standing, and he told me he was taking it to the state attorney general unless I could explain to him why his family's neighbors kept losing their farms to companies that all somehow led back to us." Ashford turned around. "I offered him money instead. A lot of it. Enough to disappear comfortably and never look back. I told him it was the only version of this story where nobody's brother ends up hurt worse than a bruised conscience. He took it. Your brother," Ashford went on, "asked too many questions, just like your father used to warn me you never would. I always said you were the easy one to work with. You built half your empire standing on my back and my father's silence, Gerald," Daniel said. "Every wing of that Fifth Avenue office, every ribbon cutting with your name on the plaque. You let me believe I earned all of it clean." Ashford's jaw tightened, the first crack in 40 years of practiced composure. "You wanted to believe it was clean, Daniel. That's not the same thing as me lying to you. You never once asked how 3 farms in one county went from family-owned to development-ready in under 18 months. You signed what I put in front of you because you wanted out of Kentucky more than you wanted the truth. Don't stand in my office now and pretend you were some innocent bystander." "Where is he?" Daniel's voice was low, dangerous, in a way it had never been in 20 years of boardrooms. "Where is my brother?" What Ashford told him next, quietly, almost clinically, as though describing a business decision rather than a human life, was that Robert hadn't been harmed the way Daniel feared. He'd been paid off. Threatened, yes, and pressured hard, but ultimately paid a significant sum to disappear quietly, rather than take his evidence to the state attorney general's office, where it could have unraveled the entire land scheme and the fledgling company that Ashford and a young, ambitious Daniel Whitmore were just beginning to build. Robert had taken the money. He'd left, and out of shame or fear or both, he had simply never come back, changing his name somewhere along the way and cutting off every connection to a family and a town he believed he'd betrayed just as much as he'd been betrayed by. He was, as far as Ashford's people had been able to determine years earlier, while quietly monitoring the situation, alive. Living somewhere outside of Nashville, Tennessee, under a different name, working as a mechanic entirely unaware, or unwilling to find out, that his own son had grown up less than 90 miles from where he'd started his new life. For a long moment after Ashford finished speaking, Daniel simply stood there staring at a man he had once considered a mentor, a father figure of sorts during those first hungry years in New York, when Walter Whitmore had been 3 states away and unreachable by phone half the time. He thought about every dinner Ashford had bought him, every piece of advice, every reassurance that ambition justified the shortcuts. He understood now that none of it had been generosity. It had been cultivation. Ashford hadn't mentored a young man from Kentucky. He had recruited a signature. "You're going to help me find him," Daniel said quietly, "or I take everything I have, every filing, every cancelled check, every county record with my own name on it, to the state attorney general myself, and I'll let the company burn along with your reputation. I don't care what it costs me anymore, Gerald. I stopped caring somewhere around the 3rd cancelled check my father wrote to a woman he told me had left town." Ashford studied him for a long moment, calculating, the way Daniel had watched him calculate 100 negotiations over the years. Whatever he saw in Daniel's face told him the calculation wasn't going to work this time. Daniel left that office and didn't go back to his Manhattan headquarters for 6 days. The acquisition Whitmore and Ashford development had been finalizing. The largest in company history, worth well over $400 million set to close within the month, sat untouched on Daniel's desk. His board called, his lawyers called, Ashford himself called, twice, his tone shifting from icy composure to something closer to panic as he began to understand that Daniel Whitmore was actually, seriously, considering walking away from the deal of his career. Daniel drove to Nashville instead. It took him 3 days and the help of a private investigator to track down a mechanic named Robert Wills, no longer Whitmore, the name changed legally almost 20 years earlier, working out of a small independent auto shop on the outskirts of the city. The investigator, a retired Nashville detective named Frank Delgado, warned Daniel before they got close that people who spend 2 decades hiding usually have their reasons, and that showing up unannounced could just as easily send Robert running again as bring him home. "I need to do this myself," Daniel said. "Whatever happens." Daniel sat in his rental car outside that shop for nearly 45 minutes before he found the nerve to walk in, running through a dozen opening lines in his head and discarding every one of them as either too formal or too raw. Robert looked older, weathered, grey creeping into hair that used to be as dark as Daniel's. He looked up from the engine he was working on, wiped his hands on a shop rag, and froze the same way Daniel had frozen on that gravel driveway in Millbrook County days earlier. "Danny!" His voice cracked on the old childhood nickname nobody had used in over 2 decades. What followed wasn't a business negotiation, and for once in his adult life, Daniel Whitmore didn't try to control it like one. He simply told his brother the truth, about their father's letter, about Emily, about the son Robert never knew he had, about a 16-year-old boy sitting in a farmhouse kitchen in Kentucky who had spent his entire life wondering what happened to a father he'd never once been told the truth about. Robert broke down in the middle of that auto shop in a way that took Daniel entirely by surprise. 22 years of guilt and shame and self-imposed exile finally reaching their breaking point. He sat down on an overturned bucket, his hands still stained with engine grease, and told Daniel things Daniel hadn't known to ask about. How many nights he'd almost picked up the phone and called home, how many times he'd driven within an hour of Millbrook County and turned around, convinced everyone would be better off believing he was simply gone. "I told myself I was protecting you all," Robert said, Turns out I was just protecting myself from having to look anybody in the eye and explain what a coward I'd been. He laughed, hollow and humorless. I have a son, 16 years old, and I've been 3 hours away this whole time, fixing strangers' transmissions, telling myself it was safer this way. Daniel didn't have an easy answer for that, so he didn't try to give one. He simply sat with his brother in that garage, 2 men in their 40s, who had spent the entirety of their adult lives running from the exact same family in opposite directions, for reasons that turned out to be far more connected than either of them had ever realized. Telling Emily that Robert was alive was, in its own way, harder than confronting Ashford had been. Daniel drove back to Millbrook County the same night he left Nashville, and found her on the porch again, like the first time, like she'd been waiting there for news for 22 years, without ever quite admitting to herself that she was waiting. "He's alive," Daniel said before she could ask. "He's in Nashville. He's been there for years. Gerald paid him to disappear, and he was too ashamed to ever come back." Emily sat down hard on the porch step, her hand pressed flat against her chest like she needed to physically hold something in place. "All this time," she whispered. "All this time I told myself he must be dead, because if he wasn't, that meant he chose to stay away, that he knew about Caleb and chose it anyway." "He didn't know," Daniel said quickly. "Emily, he had no idea he had a son. I need you to understand that before anything else happens here." It took her a long time to speak again, and when she did, her voice was steadier than Daniel expected. "Does Caleb get a say in this? Because I promised him a long time ago that I would never make choices about his father without him in the room." Daniel nodded. It was, he realized, the first time in this entire ordeal that anyone had thought to center the one person who had actually been asking the real question the whole time. The reunion that happened 3 weeks later, in that same worn farmhouse kitchen with the pencil marks on the doorframe, wasn't the kind of clean, cinematic ending Daniel might once have expected from his life. It was messy and tearful, and full of long silences where nobody quite knew what to say to bridge 22 years of absence. Caleb didn't run into his father's arms the way a movie might have written it. He stood in the doorway for a long time, studying Robert the same careful, guarded way he'd studied Daniel days earlier, before finally, quietly, asking the only question that had ever really mattered to him. "Why didn't you ever come back?" Robert didn't have a perfect answer. He had shame and fear, and 22 years of believing his family was better off without him. "I was scared," he finally admitted, crouching down slightly so he was eye-level with a boy who was nearly as tall as he was. "I was scared that if I came back, I'd have to explain to you why I wasn't here and I didn't have a good enough reason. I still don't, honestly. There's no version of the explanation that makes it okay that I missed 16 years of your life." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the second question, the one Daniel suspected had been sitting underneath the first one the whole time. "Are you going to leave again?" "No," Robert said, and something in the plainness of it, the total absence of any polish or performance, seemed to land with Caleb in a way that no amount of apology could have. "I'm not leaving again. I don't care what it cost me to stay close. I'm done being the guy who runs." It wasn't enough in that first evening to erase 16 years of absence. Caleb didn't hug him. He didn't call him Dad. He simply nodded once and said, "Okay, we'll see." But it was a beginning, and sometimes Daniel was learning, watching the two of them from across that kitchen. A beginning was the only honest place a family could actually start. The board meeting where Daniel announced he was walking away from the acquisition remains, to this day, one of the more talked-about moments in the company's history. 7 of the 9 board members argued against it for nearly 3 hours, laying out in exhaustive detail exactly what it would cost: the breakup fee, the lawsuits, the credit downgrade, the years it would take to rebuild investor confidence. One board member, a woman named Diane Foster, who had sat on the board for over a decade and rarely spoke in meetings, finally asked the question that ended the debate. "Daniel," she said, "if none of this ever came out, if you could keep the deal, keep the company's reputation, and just quietly live with what you now know, would you actually be able to live with it?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He thought about Caleb's face on that gravel driveway, the guarded, careful way a 16-year-old boy had learned to hold himself because the adults in his life kept disappearing or lying to him. He thought about his father's handwriting on the back of an old photograph. He thought about a missing persons file marked inactive for 22 years. "No," he finally said, "I wouldn't." That was the end of the debate. 2 months later, Daniel Whitmore withdrew Whitmore and Ashford Development from the $400 million acquisition, forfeiting a substantial breakup fee and, in the process, exposing enough of the company's early land practices to trigger a formal state investigation into Gerald Ashford's decades of quiet farmland manipulation across 3 counties. It cost Daniel a significant portion of his fortune, several key business relationships, and no small amount of public humiliation as the story broke across regional and eventually national business news. He didn't rebuild in New York. He didn't need to anymore. Instead, Daniel used what remained of his resources to buy back, quietly and at fair market value, every farm Ashford's shell companies had improperly acquired over the years, including, first among them, the Carter family land, which he signed over to Emily outright, along with the restored deed to his father's own property next door. He funded a scholarship in his brother Robert's name at the local high school for students planning to study agricultural law, and he spent considerably more time than his old assistant ever thought possible, sitting on that same worn porch, learning, slowly, imperfectly, at 45 years old, how to actually be present in a family he had spent 2 decades pretending he didn't need. Gerald Ashford's own story ended less gracefully. The State Attorney General's investigation, once it gained momentum, uncovered far more than the Carter farm alone, a pattern spanning nearly a dozen families across 3 counties, each one pressured, deceived, or quietly bought out of land that had belonged to them for generations. Ashford resigned from the company that still carried half his name within the year. Facing a wave of civil suits from families Daniel personally made sure had lawyers to represent them. Daniel never took any satisfaction in watching a mentor's reputation collapse. What he felt, mostly, was relief that the truth had finally stopped being something people in Millbrook County had to whisper about behind closed doors. Robert Wills, who eventually, quietly, began going by Robert Whitmore again, though it took him the better part of a year to feel like he'd earned the name back, moved to a small rental just outside Millbrook County, close enough to see Caleb several times a week without pushing faster than the boy was ready for. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were setbacks. There was a Christmas that first year when Caleb told his father flatly that he wasn't ready to spend the holiday together, and Robert respected it without argument, which Daniel suspected did more to earn the boy's trust than any grand gesture could have. Slowly, across a second year, something that looked genuinely like a father and son relationship began to take root. Emily didn't forgive him overnight, and Daniel never asked her to pretend that she had. There were nights that fall when she still looked at him across that same worn kitchen table, with something closer to old grief than warmth, and Daniel learned to sit with that rather than rush past it. He learned to show up on Tuesdays to help Caleb with algebra homework he barely remembered how to do himself. He learned to fix a leaking porch step instead of simply hiring someone from Louisville to do it for him. He learned slowly that some kinds of trust can only be rebuilt one small, unremarkable Tuesday at a time, and that no amount of money could speed up that particular kind of interest. But something began growing again between Emily and Daniel in the quiet, unhurried months that followed. Not the same love they'd had at 23, reckless and uncomplicated, but something steadier, something that had survived 22 years of silence and came out the other side more honest for it. And Caleb, 16 years old now, no longer a boy holding a faded photograph on a gravel driveway, but a young man slowly getting to know both a father and an uncle he'd spent his whole life wondering about, finally understood something Daniel Whitmore had needed 45 years, and the loss of nearly everything he'd built to understand himself. The man who came home believing he owned everything discovered in the end that the poorest-looking people on that dirt road possessed the one thing his billions had never been able to buy, the truth about his own family. And sometimes that truth is worth more than every acquisition, every skyscraper, every zero on a balance sheet a person spends their whole life chasing. If this story moved you, if you found yourself holding your breath somewhere in the middle of it, do me a favor and let me know in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about family, truth, and the things money can never actually buy, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because there's a lot more where this came from. Give this video a like if you made it to the end. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.